Ma vero?
Quante lacrime, figlio mio, quante lacrime.
Papà, aspetta, non andare via. Abbiamo parlato così poco tra noi. Senti, papà, avevo tante domande da farti.
In the film 8½, the relationship between the protagonist and his own memory is rather complex. For example, in the dream scene at the beginning of the film, Guido meets his father and mother, but viewers know that the film presents distorted versions of his parents from a dream. How similar are they to Guido's actual parents? To what extent can we consider Guido's parents real, given that he himself is a fictional character? On the other hand, what relationship do these fictional characters have with director Fellini, given that we know Fellini is staging a representation of himself through Guido? Later in the film, Guido, under pressure from the producer, must evaluate screen tests of actresses and make decisions about who will play the parts in the film. When watching these screen tests, we witness the search for characters who must reinterpret figures from Guido's past and present life. Obviously, none of them can fully embody the real people, yet their similarity offends some of the people watching the screening, particularly Guido's wife Luisa. Luisa storms out of the room in fury, and Guido chases after her, not understanding or feigning not to understand what has upset her. Luisa then explains that the exploitation of his personal experiences for the creation of a narrative is something obscene and intolerable, especially since Guido provides a partial version of events that often do not take into account the perspectives of others, and self-absolving version without self-criticism. In the first episode we mentioned, the deformation of reality is taken in charge by the syntax of the dream that condenses meanings, synthesizes them, and makes extensive use of metaphors and metonymies that are difficult to understand. In the second episode, however, Guido's distortion of reality appears to be more deliberate and aware, and seems to aim precisely to protect him from any criticism, to avoid any responsibility and necessity for personal growth. We cannot blame Luisa for feeling offended at being so easily replaced by a simulacrum, by a theatrical performance. And we can't blame her for reproaching Guido for how he manipulates reality in his favor. However, Fellini is not Guido, but he uses Guido to show something about himself. And while he shows us Guido who manipulates and lies, Fellini confesses on the one hand to being a liar, and on the other hand he unmasks himself. What, then, is the triangular relationship between reality, creativity, and lying? How much must one lie to be truthful about oneself? What is the boundary between creative lying and malicious lying, and what limit must we set to respect others' feelings? The protagonist in Christopher Nolan's movie Memento wakes up from bouts of total amnesia and attempts to piece together his past using clues he had sent to himself, such as notes, photographs, and even tattoos. We see the protagonist engaged in a reconstruction that he must start over each time due to the ongoing destruction of his memory. But to our surprise, we will discover at the end of the film that this reconstruction is not entirely sincere. Everything the character has done is to build an image of himself that he could please. How many times have we modified a memory to improve our self-image? How many times have we done so consciously, and how many times have we done so unintentionally? Rousseau's Confessions, a book that, in a sense, inaugurated the contemporary idea of reflections on oneself, is a book full of inaccuracies and falsifications. Should this be a cause for wonder, or a confirmation that the truth about oneself often manifests through symptoms, metaphors, or the kind of metaphor that is a falsehood? Modifying the past sometimes amounts to nothing more than a simple defense against pain, as in the film Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind by Charlie Kaufman, where two lovers try to erase memories of their relationship due to too much pain, but inevitably meet again. The attempt to forget is unsuccessful, and in the film, this is perhaps a reason for hope. Beckett's works, such as Happy Days and Krapp's Last Tape, feature attempts to reconstruct the present or past, with varying degrees of success. In Happy Days, The protagonist, Winnie, though semi-buried in sand, continues to affirm that she is living a happy day in an eternal present, which she interprets with a sort of pathological optimism. The fact that in the second act she is no longer buried only up to her waist, but even up to her neck, seemed to represent a worsening of her situation, but her optimism is not cracked in any way. In contrast, Krapp's last tape portrays the protagonist listening to a device that plays back his own voice from the past. The tape represents a past that has been transformed into a physical object by which he evaluates himself, comparing the expectations of his younger self, who speaks to him through the recording, to his present self, who listens to it. Perhaps we can only understand the past as a form of narrative. With this premise, Borges theorizes in his story Tlön, Uqbar, Orbis Tertius, that imagination not only alters how we connect to the past, but can even create the objects and archaeological artifacts that serve as proof of its existence. Based on these hypotheses, an Italian artist, Luigi Serafini, has created a work called Codex Serafinianus. It is a sort of encyclopedia of completely imaginary objects, beings, and sciences, accompanied by illustrations and captions in an invented language written with an invented alphabet. Although we do not know if the objects and their world described in the Codex Serafinianus belong to the past, present, or future, we can still hypothesize that this reconstruction was based on the concept of a codex, a book that helps to codify reality, as in our medieval past, for example. The fact that this book does not represent any intent to lie, but is simply fantastic, highlights its purely creative aspect, but it also brings us back to a so-called fantastic pseudology pathology that implies an individual's need to lie without any specific purpose. Is it reprehensible for a person to lie without intending to deceive anyone? Does this deviation from reality cause suffering? It is a question that is difficult to solve because, on the one hand, a person who gives us an erroneous representation of the facts creates many problems, but on the other hand, the ability to create fantastic worlds that depart from reality is what we generally define as fabulatory ability. The protagonist in James Turner's The Secret Life of Walter Mitty persistently retreats into an imaginative realm where he transforms everyday experiences into extraordinary scenarios in his mind. Can we criticize him for this? There is a philosophical theory called modal realism that imagines a stratification of reality into different levels that can coexist. The philosopher who thought up this theory, David Lewis, argues that possible worlds are as real as the world we see. The Baron Munchausen, who is similar to Plautus's Miles Gloriosus, is a famous example of a compulsive liar. He is a soldier who, perhaps to increase his reputation, invents incredible adventures in which he himself is the protagonist. The need to exalt one's own personality is also common among dictators, as well as the need to reinterpret historical memory for personal purposes. Stalin, for example, never hesitated to modify testimony from the past, deleting images and names of personalities who became unacceptable to his regime from photographs or encyclopedia entries. Stalin's intention was in some way to implant an artificial reality in the memory of the subjects of his dictatorship. This is a similar operation to what we see in a famous scene from Ridley Scott's Blade Runner. One of the characters discovers that she is not human, but a replicant, and that her memory, which she believed to be authentic, is completely artificial. This idea, I think, is a nightmare for every person. Who would we be without our memory? To make a comparison with Karl Popper's definition of science, we can also ask ourselves these last two questions. Who are we if we cannot confront, if we cannot verify our memory in some way? However, who are we if we cannot falsify it?
You and your brother snuck into an empty building through a basement window. You were going to play doctor. He showed you his, and when it got to be your turn, you chickened and ran. Remember that? You ever tell anybody that? Your mother, Tyrell, anybody? Huh? You remember the spider that lived in a bush outside your window? Orange body, green legs. Watched her build a web all summer. Then one day there's a big egg in it. The egg hatched.
The egg hatched,
And?
and 100 baby spiders came out. And they ate her.
Implants. Those aren't your memories. They're somebody else's. They're Tyrell's nieces. Okay. Bad joke. I made a bad joke. You're not a replicant. Go home. Okay? No, really. I'm sorry. Go home. Want a drink? I'll get you a drink. I'll get a glass.